Okay, so what we want to do today is we want to look at this process, right? How do we use PHP to get information from users on a website and save that information? Okay. So last week we looked at a bunch of sites. We may as well, I'm just going to log in here. Whoops. Here's Herb with his lovely suit. Okay. So, go away. So Facebook allows me as the end user to add all kinds of content to their database, right? What kinds of content can I add as a Facebook user into their database? Okay, so I can add, right? I could add images if I want to go. You can tell how much time I spend on Facebook, right? I can add an image if I want. What can I add along with that image? So I can upload that file. Yeah, I can put in, right? So what's going to happen when I click post? Where does all this go? How does that process work? Right, so it sends that information to a PHP page that will look at the photo I've uploaded, and we'll do this after reading week. We'll look at how to build a file uploader with PHP. It'll also take the text that I wrote, and where are those things going to go? Where are they going to live? Where on the server? Yeah, into their database, right? So the file, that photo is going to get copied to the server, and my text, my post, is going to get saved to the database. Right? So by doing this, I'm creating new content in Facebook's database. So that is including a file, and in this case, it's also including some text, right? But notice what other things it adds along with it. It also links who I am to that piece of text in that photo, as well as it links, automatically gives it a date and time, right? I have no control over that, but the database is issuing that. So whenever somebody comes and looks at my profile, they can see when I've added that data. So on Facebook, typically we're adding photos, we're adding comments and posts. What happens when I click this button? What's actually going to happen? If I click the like button. Right, it's going to record in the database that I clicked that. Right. And now it shows me which people have clicked like on this. So all I'm doing is simply adding new data to the database every time. So there's different ways of doing it, right? It could be uploading a file. It could be typing in a box. It could be clicking on a link. What other options might I have that we don't necessarily see on Facebook? Actually, if I go into my profile, I probably could. If I click edit, so let's go in here. So I've got text boxes for typing. What are they giving me here to allow me to give input? Right, so they can give me some kind of menu selection where I can pick from. What other kinds of things do we expect to see web applications will give us that allow us to give them information? We get text boxes, we can upload files, we can click on links, we can pick from drop downs. What else could we do? Yep, we could have a list of checkboxes. When would you use checkboxes? Let's go here. We talked about this site last week. What would be an example of when would you use a checkbox and when would you use a drop-down list? What's the difference between the two of them? They both present the users with a list of choices. Vincent?
Checkboxes for multiple choices at one time.
You got it, right? So here, birth year, they're only going to let me pick one birth year.
Yeah.
However, oh, they've changed this, actually. So that's not a great example. So checkbox is when we want to give the user a list and allow them to pick multiple options. Anything else we could do? Any other controls we might give to users to allow them to give us input?
Radio box. Radio box.
Yeah, okay, when would you use a radio button?
I think the same as the drop list.
Okay.
You can only select one.
It basically is the same as a drop-down list, right? We give the user a list of choices and we're letting them pick how many options?
Just one.
Just one. So how would you decide when you're building a web application, how do I decide, why did Globe and Mail decide to make this a drop-down list? Why didn't they use radio buttons instead? You got it. So that's the choice, right? Which is actually easier for the end user to use? Radio buttons or drop-downs?
Depends
Depends
on
on
how
the
many
depends on how many choices the person has.
Right. So the question we have to ask ourselves is basically, how many choices are we giving them? If we're giving them a lot of choices, well, that's going to take up way too much room to show a radio button for all of those countries. We're going to want to use a drop-down. So what would be the benefit of a radio button instead? When would you say, no, I want to use a radio button instead of a drop-down? When would a radio button make more sense?
Yes and no. Gender,
Could be yes and no, yep.
male, gender.
For gender, for male or female.
So if like they want to subscribe to like your newsletter or something, or get an email whenever something's updated.
Yeah. So here's the basic rule. There's two things to keep in mind. How many choices do we have? If we have a lot of choices, radio buttons just aren't practical. The other thing we have to keep in mind is we might only have 2 or 3 choices, but the text on those choices could be really long. So in that case, we still might want it in a drop-down. So the other question you have to ask is, how much space do we have on the page for this? If these take up a lot of space, well, the drop-down's better because the choices are hidden unless the user clicks. If we give it a radio button, the page, when it loads, all that stuff's going to show, so we have to make sure we have enough room for it. Okay? So there's no right and no wrong. It's kind of, there's just as much art as there is science to designing a good input form for our users. Right? So what makes sense for this particular option we want to give them? What makes life easier? The best way you can possibly frustrate your users is build forms that are really hard for them to use. Right? If you build a comment form on a website, like think of Amazon where we can make reviews. If that review form was hard to use, no one's going to review any products. So laying our form out and kind of picking the right controls, and we use these more than anything else, just single line text boxes. But for users, the more we can give them menus and choices, the more they're going to like our forms because it means they have to do less typing. Right? It's always faster for them to pick a choice than for them to type it. And also when they type, there's a chance they're going to mistype something and spell it wrong. So giving them options and menus wherever we can is a good idea. We also can use buttons for input, right? We can give a user a series of buttons and they can pick one button and that tells us what input they want. So we have lots of options in terms of how we get that data from the user and what our form looks like. Okay? But the mechanics of it, the process is the same every single time. Doesn't matter if this is a Facebook photo upload, if we're signing up for a Globe and Mail, if we're reviewing a product on Amazon, here's how it works. Basically, we have 2 separate pages. Now, could you do this all in one page? Yes. I find it's messy and complicated. It's easier, I like to do this in 2 parts. The first part is where we give the user a form that asks them to give us input. So here's our form right here. There's 2 drop downs and there's a save button. Here's the form here. This is text boxes and drop downs. If we're on Amazon and we have a comment form, we'll basically just have probably one big box where we can type multiple lines of text. So our form has to match whatever inputs we want from our user. So designing forms, there's really not much logic. We really just use HTML for that, and it's pretty straightforward. You know, in this course, you're going to be building a form probably every week. By the end of the class, you'll be able to do it with your eyes closed. Okay? So that's part 1 as we build the form. Part 2 is, remember, HTML, we can kind of use HTML to collect the data. We can build those drop downs and build our text boxes and put buttons on. We don't need PHP for that. But all HTML can do is collect the data. It can't process it. It's got no brain. Okay? Here's the way I like to think about it. Your HTML form is kind of like the grocery cart when you go to the supermarket, right? Think about how you shop. When you have to go to the supermarket, we have this shopping cart and everything we want goes in it, right? So the shopping cart can collect all the inputs, but what other things do you have to do at the supermarket before you can leave that your shopping cart is not smart enough to do? Right, it can't check you out. So what, and two things basically happen at the checkout. What happens when you take that cart to the checkout line and you get up to the front? Right, so the first thing is you gotta check the prices and it can tell you how much you owe, right? Now, if somebody could invent a shopping cart that did that, I think that would be awesome. Somebody should invent that, right? You scan it on your cart and then you see a running total. Shopping cart's not that smart. Well, your HTML form, it would be great if it was that smart, but it isn't, right? It can't be checking the inputs as you put them in, really. All it does is collect them. So in the grocery store, it tells you how much you owe, but then something else happens. There's some other piece of processing that happens in the checkout line. What else happens in the checkout line after they scan your items and they tell you how much you owe? Yeah, they've got to process your payment, right? Again, it would be great if your cart could do this, right? I'm done, I'm just gonna stick my card, there's a card reader right in my card, I can pay and I can leave. That'd be great. But the cart's not that smart, your HTML form's not that smart either. It can't check the inputs and it can't process them. It can't save them, it can't send confirmation emails, can't do any of this stuff. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna collect everything in a form, ask the user for all the stuff we want, and eventually when they say I'm done, they're gonna click a submit button, which will send all that information off to another page. That page, which we're gonna use PHP for in this class, or we could use some other server-side scripting technology, it's basically going to do what happens in the checkout line. It's gonna check you out. It's gonna check all the inputs, that they match all the rules. So let's say we have a password field, and we don't want somebody to put in a password that's 1 character long. We can check that on this page. And we'll do input validation in 2 weeks. How do we check to make sure the stuff we're getting is good? And then if the stuff we're getting is good, ultimately, we want that data saved here, right? When I type the post on Facebook, we wanted it to go in the Facebook database so anyone else who's unlucky enough to be friends with my Herb Tarlick profile sees that post, right? If we're on Globe and Mail and we fill out the register, we want to go into their subscribers or their users table in the database, so I now have an account. If I'm on Amazon and I'm making a comment, I want that comment to get saved in their database, so when anybody else comes back and looks at that product, they can see the comment I added. So all of these, it's the same scenario every time. So we're gonna check their inputs, we're gonna connect to the database, and then we're gonna need to use some SQL code to actually insert that data into the database, and then it's there for good. So that's what we're gonna do today, and we wanna do it with the application we talked about last week. We're basically gonna build this part, we're gonna build a form. We said last week we were gonna make our application about video games. So we're gonna have to first make a spot in the database. We're gonna have to build a table to store the video game data. So that'll be step 1, is set up an area in here where we can store some stuff. Step 2 will be we're gonna build a form. We'll figure out what information we wanna save about video games, and then we're gonna need a form where we can input a bunch of games. And then step 3 is we're gonna need to build the processing part. We'll need a saving page that will take all the information we enter in the form, connect to our database, and every time we hit save, save a new video game into the database. Right? So that's kind of what we want to accomplish today. Next week, what we'll do is we'll then build the page where we can select all the video games out of the database and display those online. So for reference, it'll look sort of something like this, although we're not going to get into doing any design or skin on it today. So last term, and we're not going to worry about a login at this point. We'll add that later. So what we want is the video game equivalent of this form. So we'll have to figure out together what are the attributes of a video game we want to store. Presumably we're going to have a name or a title, and then we can figure out together what other things about that game we want. Eventually we'll get to a photo, but we'll leave that out. We'll do that later when we do file uploads. We'll come and add the photos on later. Too complicated for today. Okay. So this is kind of where we're going. This is what we're going to have working by the time we leave here today. And once we understand how to do this, we could build any form. Someone says, hey, I want a registration form on my website. Great. All we have to know is what field, what information do they want from people, and we build a form with those fields. They want a comment form, great, we'll build a comment form. We can build anything because they all work the exact same way. So the first thing we need to do is go into our database and set up our database, because right now we can build the form, we can build the save page, but if there's nowhere in our database to store the video game data, the data isn't going to go anywhere. We're just going to get errors when we try and save. So the first thing we need to do is log into our database, and we need to create a table there and figure out what that table is going to look like. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You can do this by using MySQL Workbench, or the simple way is just to do it through your web browser. I'm actually going to go through my browser. I'm not going to bother. We can actually get to our database this way. If you go to sql.computerstudies, this will bring a login box up where you have to enter your server username and password. So I'm just going to go to sql.computerstudies. And it's prompting me for my login on the DreamHost server. So it's going to be, your username will be GC and your student number. And your password is your database password. So this is the same password you're using in your relational database class. And it's also the same as your FTP password for connecting to the web server. So whatever you used in FileZilla to connect to the server last week, that's the password you need here. If you don't remember your password, if you log into your student email and do a search for the word DreamHost, you'll see an email with your password. Pretty soon you will all remember your password because you have to enter it pretty much every week, both in my class and in your database class. So just enter your password. So this is the browser version of using MySQL Workbench. It's ugly and it's clunky, but it saves me from having to open up MySQL Workbench. Or you can log into your database through MySQL Workbench. Doesn't matter, those are just two windows into the same place. So now I'm connected to my database server on the DreamHost server. I've also put these instructions on Blackboard in the weekly learning tools and resources folder. There's a text file here that says how to connecting to MySQL. So I've explained how you can do it through the browser. So this is the way I just did it, and this is how you do it if you want to use the MySQL Workbench client. So these instructions are in here for you anytime you need to reference them. They're here. I know this is fairly new, but you're going to be doing this twice a week, so pretty soon everybody's going to get pretty comfortable with it.
Is it okay to work on local work?
Absolutely, and that's something, if we have time to deal with at the end of the day today, I'd like to maybe show you how you could work locally. Sure.
Actually, I have it. That's why I was.
Yep, if you already set up MySQL and MAMP or WAMP locally and you're not using the DreamHost server, no problem. Then just log into your database through local. So I'll do that as well on mine. So I'll also go in through MySQL Workbench. And I have a local instance running, so if you've saved your connections, which you should, that way you don't have to log in every time. So here's my DreamHost connection on the server. This is my local server. I could log into either one of these. So Asim was suggesting logging in locally, so I just click and now I'm into my local server. So what we want to do here, we want to create a new table to store our video games, and we need to figure out what fields or what columns should go in that table. And that will then tell us what our form is going to look like for adding video games. So I'm just going to click on the SQL tab here. Actually, sorry. First thing I need to do, notice it says, please select the database. If I click on my GCR Freeman database, now I'm connected to that database. In MySQL, the way that we do it is how? So I'll connect to my DreamHost database here as well. So how do you get connected to your database? You need to run one command to start. Right, so I would run the use and the name of my database, which is GC, and then for you guys, your student number. And then I would just click on the execute button. So it shows me a little green check mark here, so now I'm connected to my database. So you guys probably did this in your relational database class already. You'll do it each week. So I can run the use command here if I'm using the browser. Clicking the link executes the use command for me, so I don't have to type it. So I'm connected in both places. So I can use either one of these. You don't need to do both. Use whichever one you like better. So then I'm going to go to my SQL tab here, or I could write my SQL query in here, doesn't matter. So what we need to do is figure out what our table is going to look like. So we're going to run a create table command. We'll call our table games. And I'll put in a set of round brackets and finish it with a semicolon. And now in here, we need to figure out what information are we going to store about each video game in our database. So we probably want to have somewhere between, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 columns for our game. So what things about a video game should we store? All right, so let's give it a name. So we'll use, how many characters do you think maximum should we allow for the name of a game? 50 is fairly standard. Do you think 50 was 50 enough? All right. And we'll also just say that it's not null, meaning you can't save a video game without a name, right? If we try to save it with a blank name, we'll get an error. So then I'll put in a comma here. What other things what other fields do we think we need? So we'll have a name of a game. What else?
Genre?
Okay. You know what? We're going to come back to genre next week, and here's why. What we don't, we're going to look next week at how we fill a drop-down list, because when we have got genre, we don't probably want people to type it in, right? We want to give them a list, and we're going to make them pick. But we'll look next week at how we fill a list. So next week we can add genre in here. So if I forget, sorry, remind me your name?
Brandon.
Brandon, you're responsible for reminding me next week we need a genre drop-down list. Okay? So we'll put in an age limit. What type of data will age limit be? Yeah, we'll probably make that an integer, so we'll want that to be a number. And again, we'll say that that's required, right? The age limit is something we're going to need. We probably want 2 or 3, anywhere between 2 and 3 more fields. Vincent? Yeah, that's a good one. So I'll put it as release_date. And that could just be a year probably. We probably don't need the exact date. We could just store the year. So what type of data should store that year? Yeah, we'll make that an integer as well. Also not null, because every video game has a release date. There's not going to be such thing as an optional release date. Anything else we should add, or is that?
Platform.
Okay. Now platform, so let's think about it. That's a good one. Now how would somebody enter the platform? So if we're giving them a form for entering games, what kind of control, what would we give the user for a platform?
It's a drop down.
How many platforms could a game have? Multiple. So that would probably be a good candidate for a checkbox list, right? Because this game, it could be an Xbox game, could also be a PS4 game. So let's leave that one out for now, just because, again, we'll have to get into how to build a dynamic checkbox list. But good idea. Anything else?
Can we just add those variables now and just comment them out for now?
You know what? We could, but we're going to have to change this table later anyway, so we'll add them on later. Like later on, we'll also add a field for a photo, so we can have a picture of the game.
Do user rated? Like, what it was rated? Like how good, like a 10, what, like a score?
0 to 10.
Okay, so the question is, we could, now there's two different ways of doing it, right? If we make it so that different users can rate it, like we have multiple, like every user can rate it, then we're gonna have to store that separately, right? Because the game won't have one rating. If we all played the game and we all rated it, every single rating would have to get stored. Okay, so that's a great idea, but again, it's making it a little more complicated than we need it for today. So we may have a chance to add that later.
Size.
Size? Okay. So what kind of information would we, what type of data would that be? Sorry?
Diameter is not integer.
It's not an integer?
Decimal.
Okay, so let's use a decimal. And how big of a number might we allow for this? What would be the biggest number we should allow?
This depends on the unit.
Right, but and how many decimal places should we allow? 2 decimal places. What would be the highest possible value you think we should store for this?
Is this file size in gigabytes? Is that what you mean by size?
So the file size in gig.
That's the maximum size that a 2 rate is capable of.
Okay. Well, actually, it would have to be, if 50 was the largest, it actually would need to be 4,2, right? Because the way decimal numbers work, this is the total number of digits, including the decimal, right? And I guarantee you guys are taking your database course with Jarrett. That'll be a question on your midterm, guaranteed, right? 4 and 2. So that means 4 total digits, maximum, and 2 decimal places. So the highest number this would possibly allow is 99.99, right? If we tried to put in 100, we'd get an error. So I think we're good. So we've got a text value, 2 whole numbers, and then a decimal value. So some of the other fields, all the other things you guys have suggested are great, but I don't want to make it overly complicated for today, but we'll add some of those fields in later.
So in that case, your release date, using integer release date is fine.
Yes, because we're only going to store the year. We're not going to store it as an actual date. We really just care about the year of release. Yeah, not the actual month and day.
We can add type, like it is a racing game or something like that.
We could, but again, we'll need another table for that, and then we'll need to join those together, right? Because we'll want one list of categories and tagging it. So again, a little bit more advanced. We certainly could do it, and maybe once you get into table relationships in your database class, that's something we can look at adding in here later. So I think this is sufficient for now for us to build a form and start putting some games in. Okay. So we create it like this. Again, yes, we could, but those will be also lookup tables, right? Because one publisher, EA Sports, might have 10 games. So to make it efficient, yes, we could put in a text field where we type in EA Sports 10 times if they have 10 games. That's not really ideally how we want to do it. So I'd rather come back to that once you guys learn how to manage those relationships in your database class. And then we can do it properly in here. Okay. So I'm just going to click on Go and run this script.
The release date, you need to put in, you need to import about 2020 to 2012, like that. So I think you need to set a limit.
Yep, but we don't have to do that here. We'll do that later on in our code, right? That's part of the processing here, right? Part of the checkout where we're checking whether the input values they gave us are valid or not. So we'll do that in a few weeks. That's what our class is all about. So for today, we'll let them put in anything, but in a few weeks, we can decide what, for example, the minimum or maximum dates are for release date. So we'll come to that. Today, we'll just save whatever the user gives us. Okay? So our database is done. It tells me my table is created. So I should have a blank table with 4 columns now. So if I go back and click on my database up here, I'll just do it in a new tab so I leave the code open for you. So now I have a games table. There's no data in here. And if I look at the structure, we've got our 4 fields: name, age limit, release date, and size. So now we've got this blank table, so now we can start putting data into it. It also tells us there's no index defined. We'll come back to this again in a week or two. You'll talk about this in your database class, about creating indexes so we have some way to uniquely identify each of our records. Does anybody have any questions so far about building our table? Okay, if you're in here, are you using the browser like me? Okay, click on your database name right here at the top. And it shows you all of the tables in your database. I have a lot of them. You probably have very few or none. If you click this properties button right here that says structure, it shows you a visual representation of your table. Okay?
Mine's not showing all the fields and stuff. I don't know if I clicked something.
Okay, so make sure once you've typed the command in here, whoops, I should go back. Yeah. Once you've typed your create table command, make sure you click on the go button. Right, or because it doesn't execute. Okay. It says it's run successfully. Click your database name. There you go. Okay, so now our database is set up. We don't need to do anything else in here. We just needed to have a place to save those video games. So we're going to take a quick pause here. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10 after 4, and we'll start building our form, and then we'll build our PHP page to actually save those video games into the database. And I know you have a question. Sure. I accidentally wiped it out, so I'll redo it.
Hey, did you say you're allocating that quiz tonight?
Sorry?
Am I allocating that quiz tonight, or does it have to be here?
Yeah, you can do it. You can do it tonight.
I'll have my laptop next.
Actually, just give me 1 minute. What I would like to open at a specific time for you. Actually, okay, you tell me what time you think you can do it, and I'll set the timer to open and then close it when you're done.
All right.
So what did we have? We had name.
I think 7:30 is a good time.
Okay, so I'll open it at 20 after 7. I'll leave it open till 8 o'clock.
All right. Thanks.